Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are going to explore how an era of absolutely unprecedented disaster and chaos, the 17th century, actually became the crucible that forged our modern world. When we think of history, it's really easy to look back and just see the smooth, upward line of progress. But let me tell you, the 1600s were anything but smooth. It was a time of immense, painful struggle. But the fascinating thing is, out of that deep darkness came the foundational ideas of our political systems, our science, and our art.
So, let's dive right into this by asking ourselves a pretty fundamental question. What does humanity actually do when faced with an overwhelming, simultaneous barrage of demographic, economic, and political catastrophes? Seriously, how do we respond when the very fabric of society seems to be unraveling from literally every possible direction at the exact same time?
To make sense of this incredibly turbulent century, we're going to walk through 4 key chapters today. The Century of Crisis, Monarchs, Parliaments, and Power, the Baroque Drama, and finally, the Scientific Revolution.
Let's kick things off with Chapter 1, the Century of Crisis, or what historians often call the General Crisis of the 1600s.
When you actually stack all these simultaneous crises together, it's honestly overwhelming. We aren't just dealing with a demographic nightmare, a plague and war. We're stacking economic collapse, like falling trade and rising taxes, right on top of that. Then you add in violent political revolts erupting everywhere. And, as if the universe decided that just wasn't enough, you get a climactic crisis known as the Little Ice Age, which brought freezing temperatures and completely destroyed crops. It was literally the perfect storm of human misery.
The absolute climax of all this misery was the 30 Years' War. It kicks off in 1618 with the famous defenestration of Prague, which, yes, literally involved throwing government officials out of a window. It started out as a religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants, but it rapidly mutated. By the 1620s and 30s, it escalated into this massive continental political showdown that dragged in major powers like Denmark, Sweden, and France. It was just a brutal, devastating grind that didn't end until 1648.
And that end finally came with the Peace of Westphalia. This treaty was a total game changer. Sure, weakened the Habsburgs and established France as a dominant power, but its most crucial legacy was establishing the modern principle of state sovereignty. Basically, it gave birth to the idea that countries actually have the right to govern themselves without some external power interfering. That is a concept that still forms the absolute bedrock of our geopolitical world today.
Moving on to Chapter 2, Monarchs, Parliaments, and Power, the Battle for Control.
As the crisis raged on, nations were desperately trying to impose some sort of order, and they took radically different approaches. Let's look at Spain first. While France was on the rise, the Spanish monarchy was locked in this slow, unstoppable decline. A major reason for this was a shift in how they ruled. Spanish kings started delegating their actual day-to-day governing power to a valido. Think of a valido as a highly trusted royal minister who essentially managed the entire state so the king didn't have to.
Well, spoiler alert, this delegation strategy backfired spectacularly. Philip III handed the reins to the Duke of Lerma, and his policies, like expelling the Moriscos, cost Spain a massive amount of highly skilled agricultural labor. Then, Philip IV let the Count Duke of Oliveras run the show. His aggressive attempts to centralize power sparked massive rebellions in 1640, which eventually cost Spain control of Portugal forever. The whole thing ends with Charles II, the last Spanish Habsburg, dying without an heir, plunging Europe into yet another massive war.
Now let's jump over to France and see an entirely different approach to finding order. You absolutely would not find King Louis XIV delegating his power to a valido. Instead, he famously declared, "The state is me." He consolidated all legislative, executive, and judicial powers directly into his own hands. This is the absolute peak of absolute monarchy, where royal power was considered divine and the king answered to absolutely no one but God.
But hey, holding on to that much absolute power requires a massive amount of wealth. To fund his vision, Louis applied a really strict economic policy called mercantilism. This was a highly aggressive push to enrich the French state by heavily promoting domestic industry and maximizing exports. It was essentially an economic machine designed entirely to feed the absolute power of the monarch. And this perfectly illustrates the ultimate political showdown of the 17th century. On one hand, you have France's brand of absolutism, unchecked power, totally personal governance, forcing nobles into submission and demanding a single religion. But then, across the Channel in England, you have parliamentarianism developing. Over there, the king's power is distinctly limited by a parliament, which is a tradition tracing all the way back to the Magna Carta. It's the ultimate clash of ideologies, the total concentration of power versus shared limited power.
Just to help you truly grasp the jaw-dropping scale of Louis XIV's absolutism, consider the number 700. That is how many rooms were in his Palace of Versailles. And listen, this wasn't just a big house. It was an architectural propaganda tool. By forcing the nobility to literally live there with him, Louis kept them directly under his watchful eye. They were distracted by endless court life and completely stripped of any independent regional power they might have had back home. Brilliant, really.
Meanwhile, as France was busy building lavish palaces, England's path to order was incredibly bloody. When Kings James I and Charles I tried to govern as absolute monarchs, the pushback triggered a massive civil war. The Parliamentary Army literally defeated their own king in battle, leading to the completely unprecedented, shocking trial and execution of Charles I. Decades of turmoil later, the Glorious Revolution happens, giving us the historic Bill of Rights in 1689. That document definitively stated that the king could not make laws or levy taxes without parliament, cementing a constitutional monarchy that heavily influences our modern democracies today.
Which brings us to Chapter 3, the Baroque drama, art born from crisis.
You know, you can actually see the trauma of the 17th century spilling right over into the culture of the time. Previously, the Renaissance spirit was all about harmony, balance, and the serene, idealized restraint. But the Baroque spirit violently rejected that chill vibe. It embraced dramatic movement, intense tension, and a gritty, raw realism that flat out refused to hide the ugliness of the world. The art simply had to match the extreme, chaotic emotions of the times.
To really pull those intense emotions out of the viewer, artists deployed some incredible new techniques. Bernini used dynamic, twisting movement in his sculptures. Architects like Borromini designed these bold, undulating facades that seemed to almost defy gravity. Painters like Caravaggio fully embraced raw realism. He was out there depicting saints with dirty feet and worn-out clothes so they looked just like the ordinary, suffering people of the era. And then you have Velázquez, Rembrandt, and Rubens mastering this exuberant movement and intense lighting. All of these powerful emotional techniques were aggressively harnessed by the Catholic Church and absolute monarchs as pure propaganda, designed to overawe the public and project unquestionable greatness.
A really powerful example of this entire vibe is a technique called tenebrism. It's the use of extreme, almost violent contrasts of light and shadow. Think about how perfectly that captured the mood of the entire century. It's basically a visual metaphor for humanity trying desperately to find a single, intense source of light in a period surrounded by deep, overwhelming darkness.
Thankfully, that light did finally arrive. Chapter 4, The Scientific Revolution, The Dawn of Reason.
Thinkers of the 17th century, like Francis Bacon and René Descartes, completely rejected the old ways of blindly adhering to classical texts or unquestioned church authority. Instead, they decided to bring order to a chaotic universe by systemizing a highly structured approach, the scientific method. It's a beautifully logical progression. You observe a phenomenon, you formulate a hypothesis, you design an experiment, analyze the results, and boom, you state a universal scientific law. It seems so basic to us now, right? But at the time, this structured demand for actual proof was entirely revolutionary.
This new reliance on actual observation led to arguably the most spectacular shift in human history, the realization that we are not, in fact, the center of the universe. First, Copernicus introduces the heliocentric theory. Then, by 1633, Galileo is using a telescope to visually confirm it. Now, he faces intense, dangerous resistance from the Inquisition for saying it out loud, but the scientific method couldn't be stopped. It all culminates in the late 17th century when Isaac Newton steps up and formulates the law of universal gravitation.
I think this quote truly captures the essence of this dawn of reason. Knowledge must be based on direct observation of nature, experimentation, and mathematical reasoning. Ultimately, the scientific revolution replaced fear, superstition, and chaos with observation, math, and universal laws. Laws that could finally explain both why an apple falls to the ground on Earth and why the planets trace their exact orbits in the sky. It's mind-blowing when you think about it.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, we can clearly see the incredible transformation that took place. Out of literal freezing temperatures, devastating plagues, and brutal, grinding wars of the 1600s, the very foundations of our modern reality were forged. We got the vital concept of state sovereignty from the Peace of Westphalia. We got the blueprints for modern democracies through the English Bill of Rights. And we got the absolute bedrock of all modern technology through the scientific method and mathematical physics.
I want to leave you with a provocative question to chew on as we sign off today. Looking back at everything we've just covered, which of these hard-won breakthroughs from humanity's most chaotic century has the biggest impact on your life right now? Is it the scientific method you rely on for every single piece of modern tech you own? Is it the state sovereignty that defines your nation's borders? Or is it the constitutional rights that limit the power of the people who govern you? It is a fascinating thing to consider. Thanks for exploring the crazy, chaotic 17th century with me, and keep questioning the world around you.